Hi, I'm Shana Meyerson with the Yoga of War podcast, here today with media watchdog David Litman. If you appreciate and find value in these important discussions, please consider supporting the show so I can continue to bring you such amazing and esteemed guests. Details are pinned in the comments below. CAMERA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, shouldn't have to exist. Neither should a whole slew of watchdog organizations whose 24-hour, 7 days a week mission is to monitor the relentless anti-Israel bias that plagues the media. Once upon a time, media objectivity was the standard. Newspapers and broadcast did something absolutely unheard of today. They just reported the news. Not from the perspective of the left, not from the perspective of the right. No agenda, and with only one goal: to inform the public of facts. Weird, right? These days, every media outlet has an agenda. There's truly no such thing as unbiased reporting or journalistic integrity. And sadly, one of the most pervasive and predominant narratives is the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and by default, largely anti-Semitic one. The challenges presented by this phenomenon go far beyond the pages of the New York Times or the airwaves of the BBC. They even go beyond politics and diplomacy and actually foster a hostile and increasingly violent society that threatens the very existence, safety, and security of the Jewish state, as well as Jewish people all across the globe. Today, David Litman from camera.org and I will discuss the decades-old scourge of anti-Israel media bias, what CAMERA does to recalibrate the imbalances, and why the world so desperately needs accurate reporting. David M. Litman is a senior higher education analyst at the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, CAMERA. His work is focused on anti-Israel bias in both academic institutions and media outlets, as well as on anti-Israel lawfare. Before joining CAMERA, David spent 5 years as a research fellow focusing on anti-Israel bias, international law, and human rights issues in the United Nations and international courts. David graduated magna cum laude from Case Western Reserve School of Law and holds a BA in International Studies. David, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
I think it's such an important conversation that so many people just really don't understand. So in case there are listeners out there who are not familiar with CAMERA or even with the concept of a media watchdog, can you start by explaining the history behind CAMERA, when and why it was founded, and what exactly you do?
Right. So CAMERA began about 42 years ago, 43 years ago, actually, in 1982, when the community really around the country began realizing how pervasive the issue of media bias was when it came to coverage of Israel and the conflict with its Arab neighbors. Back then, CAMERA was an organization, sort of a network of chapters across the country. The Boston chapter is what has grown into the organization that is CAMERA today. And how we have worked over the years has really involved a number of tactics to keep journalists and keep media outlets accountable. Of course, we communicate directly with journalists, with editors, when we see errors in coverage, when we see false claims or misleading claims or omissions, and we secure corrections. I believe in 2024, we achieved something over a little bit over 600 corrections.
Wow.
From media outlets around the world. And now that I say world, I should mention that Camera has grown to be international. We're not just focused on American media. We have a Camera UK branch, which covers media outlets in the UK. We have Camera Espanol, which of course covers media outlets in Spanish language, particularly those in Spain and South America, of course. We also have Camera Arabic, which covers Arabic outlets. Of course, we don't bother with Al Jazeera.
May I interrupt for 1 second? Who is your audience when you're doing Arabic? Is your audience an Arabic population who is interested in this, or are you just reporting the Arabic media to the broader, say, Jewish world or pro-Israel world?
Well, in the end, the intended audience for our corrections is both. The way, for example, Camera Arabic works is really by communicating with the Arabic outlets, BBC Arabic, France 24 Arabic, CNN Arabic, Al Hora, which is sort of the kind of US, it's like the Arabic equivalent of Voice of America.
Okay.
And of course, the goal is the general Arab public that is getting this false information. Our work is to try to make sure that they're getting more accurate information, holding a fire to the feet of the reporters and journalists by calling them out. And of course, that's much easier when you're dealing with Arabic outlets that are, I guess what you would call departments of Western media outlets, and thus there's still some sense of professionalism. They have standards that we can really deal with. When you're talking about a place like Al Jazeera, it's a propaganda outlet, so we're not going to bother with that.
May I ask, do you have a sense of how many subscribers you have who are actually Arabic speaking subscribers or in the Arabic world who are interested in this?
That's a very good question. I do not have the answer for that.
Okay.
I would have to ask our folks in the Arabic department.
Okay.
But we do have, that is part of how Camera works, is we have, I believe the number's over 50, maybe over 60,000 people that are signed up for Camera, and they help us in our work. So we don't just communicate ourselves directly with editors and journalists. When there's a particularly big issue, or we're finding that a news outlet is being very resistant to correcting the record, we'll often call on our supporters to send letters, and we'll point them to the article and give them the contact information, and it's been tremendously successful, and it's one of the ways Camera really likes to operate, which is kind of working with the larger community to help achieve results.
Sure. Grassroots is everything these days. I think that the organizations that are falling behind just in the world in general, but especially in the pro-Israel world, are the one who are so intractably linked to the top-down paradigm, and not understanding that these days everything is bottom up. It's all grassroots.
Very much so. And I could say that about a lot of issues we're facing within the kind of Jewish world today, whether, way beyond media, whether it's education, or kind of local politics, some kind of BDS vote or something like that. The organizations out there in America, there's plenty of them, but there's only so much they can do. When you have people on the ground who are able to get involved and, whether it's writing letters to a local media outlet or attending a city council meeting. Coming from myself, I believe that's the most effective way that you can really push back on the false narratives that are being propagated.
Interesting. So I have a question because I have a particular interest in the war in Israel, not just because my soul resides there, but yes, I grew up in a very Zionistic family. My sister made Aliyah. She lives in Tel Aviv. This is a very personal issue with me, but of course, as a Jewish person and watching what's happening in not just the streets here in Los Angeles, but every major city, it seems, in the Western world, anti-Semitism is becoming just as big an issue, sadly, as the actual war. So I'm wondering, when you're talking about accuracy and reporting, how extensively, I mean, if at all, does like actual anti-Semitism play into your strategic focus, or are you more or less committed just exclusively to unbiased reporting just for the sake of journalistic integrity?
It's a really good question. Our focus is really on Israel and the Middle East. That being said, the issues obviously overlap.
Yeah.
There is Israel is, after all, it is a Jewish collective. It is, the Jewish state. And it becomes the target for anti-Semites around the world, and it becomes, an acceptable replacement for the word Jew, Israel, or the Zionists. So there is a lot of overlap, and unfortunately, when we're dealing with problems in media coverage of Israel, anti-Semitism has a tremendously significant role, I think, in a lot of the problems that we are seeing with the media. And so yeah, we do have to address issues of anti-Semitism in our work on occasion. I remember one of the first things I did when I joined Camera nearly 4 years ago. There was a cartoon in CNN that was blatant blood libel. And it was a depiction of a Jewish family in a house surrounded by a sea of blood. And the same cartoonist had done some other blood libel cartoons, like depicting Jews on top of a matzah sandwich, and in between the two pieces of matzah were Palestinians, and blood was gushing out. And so it's that anti-Semitism, classic and more kind of the versions that try to hide behind anti-Zionism, they are becoming more ingrained in mainstream media too. Journalists are no better than the everyday person when it comes to prejudices.
I think that the lines are blurring more and more between what is anti-Israel, what is anti-Zionist, and what is anti-Semitic. I think that at this point there's almost no difference, because just the opportunistic nature of, we look at, I look at the violent, we'll call them demonstrations, whatever, marches, all the things that are going on. In 2 months of ceasefire, they increased instead of decreased, which means this is not about Israel, no matter how you mask it. So there's no way to decouple these two things anymore. Yeah, but you answered my question. I was just wondering how much like anti-Semitism in article is like a bellwether for let's get into this, or are you, because you're focused on the Middle East, your concern really is Israel, but sometimes the undertone or the overtone happens to be anti-Semitic.
Yeah, they really bleed together, unfortunately. You really see the two together in articles and in broadcast media. If it's something that's really just an issue of anti-Semitism within the United States, for example, and it really has nothing to do with Israel. So, say, for example, Kanye West and his
Rants.
Yeah, to put it mildly. That's not something we'll address if there's, somehow some miscoverage of that in, CNN or the New York Times, simply because it really doesn't
Well,
address the
I
issue.
guess I'm thinking more. So if you want to put it in terms of yay, just that everything he says is a lot, like the actual content, like the rant is not the issue, it's the content that's the issue that is inaccurate and just replete with lies and libels.
Right, right. But even still, even though everything, everyone on camera, they're all going to agree the content is anti-Semitic, everything he's saying is false. But because we're really focused on, Middle East is in our name, Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. So we try to stick to our mission. And of course, while we're concerned about issues of anti-Semitism, we're a part of the Conference of Presidents of major North American Jewish organizations. So, we do get involved in those issues, but we really try to stay focused on our mission. And there's plenty of organizations out there trying to do it all.
Sure.
But we really want to leverage our expertise and our focus to really address the issues we know we have, the core competencies and the skills and the knowledge to really make a difference.
That makes so much sense. Okay, so I'm going to ask a sort of philosophical question, not to put you in the hot spot, but oddly enough, I rarely ask yoga questions on this show, but I actually have one today. Don't worry, it's not like a yoga question, but it's yoga based. So in yoga, we have this concept of what's called Maya. Okay, it means literally illusion. And basically, it says that there is no truth in the three-dimensional world of duality because we all have unique experiences, we all have unique information, we all have unique context that all like color our understanding of fact. And yet, though I really do make a point of constantly challenging my own assumptions. Like I listen to all the news networks, no matter how much they might make me cringe, to try to find the kernel of like what is true. But as much as I challenge my own assumptions, I keep coming to the same exact conclusion is yes, this Israel-Hamas war is a very clear case of good versus evil. It's the only conclusion I can draw, given the facts and the context and the information that I have and experience. But then I have to assume that anyone who's equally educated on the other side of this fight and willing to challenge your conclusions is going to draw the same exact conclusions about the legitimacy of their position. Right. So here's the philosophical question that perhaps you could help me with. Is there, in fact, such a thing as objective reality? And how do you at camera measure or determine it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I kind of like your anecdote about, always trying to challenge yourself and whether your perspective, are you biased? Are you the one whose judgment is clouded? And I always remark to people that if anyone can be pretty sure that they're not living in a bubble, it's me, because I spent how many years at the United Nations, then I focused on the media and universities. I've heard it all. I've heard all the arguments for and against, and how do we know what the truth is? I think your discussion about the concept of the Maya in yoga, I'm not familiar, so if I get something wrong, forgive me. The way I see it is that everyone has their own unique perspectives. Mm-hmm. And that's perfectly legitimate. And people come at issues with different sets of values. And they accord different weights to different values and different kind of core issues. Whenever you're talking about anything remotely political or socially important, you could talk about classic philosophical debates between, the collective and the individual, which is more important. I'm a red-blooded American, so I might come at issues from a very individualistic point of view, but other people might find that that point of view very offensive, and that's fine. But there are objective facts, and that's different from your perspective. Everyone has to be able to talk from the same set of objective facts that are there. You can interpret them differently, and that's legitimate. Some interpretations are, worth more than others. And that, kind of gets into, kind of more philosophy about why, logical fallacies and how you properly logic your way through a problem. But at the bottom, there's always going to be those basic objective facts. And that's what we're really focused on, in making sure that the media is communicating those basic, important material facts to the public so that they can make those value judgments themselves about how to interpret those facts. We don't see our role as going to the New York Times and telling them that they have to promote a pro-Israel perspective. We go to it from a point of view that the New York Times has to be honest about what actually happened, what are the facts, and if they don't know all the facts, to be honest about that, so that the public, again, can make those judgments for themselves.
Okay. Makes sense. So the extent of this, it's truly insidious bias bleeds into all aspects of media, not just mass media, from college newspaper. So I went to Cornell, and literally every single day I'm getting updates about what's being written in the Cornell Daily Sun, and it's horrifying. It's horrifying. And, this is our next generation of leaders, right? All these Ivy League kids who have decided that they know more about the Middle East than the experts, but let's leave that aside. So we've got college newspapers, local radio stations, textbooks, pop culture magazines, and as you guys state on your website, even dictionaries, which we think as being just as objective gets, right? But the sprawling nature of this cancer has truly metastasized throughout Western society. Cameron does incredible work in all of these arenas and more. But today, I really want to focus primarily on mainstream media and social media. So most people in this day and age, we all know, and I'd be lying if I said I'm never guilty of the same. Don't even read articles, but just look at the headlines, the tweets, the photos. And a favorite tactic of the anti-Israel media is to write a profoundly misleading and incriminating headline, and then maybe mention in the context, buried deep inside the article, where just a tiny fraction of readers are likely to see it. They'll write a headline about some Gazan teenager being violently killed by the IDF. And in only 10 paragraphs in, might they finally mention that this teen happened to be a Hamas operative who was carrying a machete, just stabbed 6 innocent Israelis in a terrorist attack after ramming them all with a car. Right. So to set the stage for our viewers, can you show us some actual stories that you feel most accurately depict this bias that we're discussing?
Yeah, let me see if I can bring this up correctly. I did bring some examples with me ready. All right, is it showing on screen?
It is.
I think a good example of what you were just talking about, it kind of fits in with this broader issue of narrative crafting, where they try to slant the story in one direction without in a way that's not faithful to the facts. And they can do that in headlines, they can do it in other ways. What is a good example that I have really harped on even before October 7th is there is this narrative that's frequently being portrayed. I've tended to focus most on CNN, so a lot of my examples will be focused on CNN. This is not to say CNN's the worst, but it's not great. It's just what I focused on. And one of the themes I noticed that they kept harping on was this idea that settler violence had gotten out of control. And you would see headline after headline about settler fanatics going crazy and harming Palestinians. The problem with this narrative is that, and you can see in this example, this article was written, I believe, in sometime in 2023, before October. And so they even try to tie it to a date of December 2022. The problem with the narrative is that the numbers actually tell a very different story that the headlines were really not portraying. And so I actually went and I found the numbers for violence in the West Bank. And this is a chart of the data I found. Goes through about halfway through 2023. In the blue, you see attacks on Israel or on Israelis from the West Bank, not from Gaza, just from the West Bank. And then in the orange, you have attacks by settlers, and these are the figures that are given by the United Nations. There's some reason to doubt those numbers, but for the sake of argument, we'll accept that the figures are correct. And you can see by these figures right away that the story here is not settler violence. The story here was Palestinian violence. And it's not even close. Now, this is not to say that any amount of settler violence is acceptable or that it's acceptable if it's less than Palestinian violence. But as an objective journalist, if you looked at this set of data and you decided that the real story is the orange, you're not approaching this from an honest or objective point of view. And as I pointed out, they also tried to pin the start of the rise in settler violence to December 2022, but as you can see from the data, it began long before. And in that case, they wanted to find an easy scapegoat, and they decided Netanyahu was an easy scapegoat, and maybe he is. That's not my job to decide, other than to show that the timeline and the data did not actually support that narrative. So this is one way in which we really see that skewing of the narrative, where I think in the case of this article, it wasn't just that the headline talked about settler violence and then 10 paragraphs down they mention Palestinian attacks. If I recall correctly, I don't think they mentioned Palestinian terror attacks at all in that article I referenced.
Are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know if you had other examples.
Oh, I could go through other examples. I thought this one was the most relevant. I mean, I listen, I'll go through a whole bunch. Yeah. I have, there's no shortage of examples.
How about one or two more?
No, okay, let's see. Which ones do I want to? Well, here's a timely one, which I think is also important, because this has to do with not just what a headline is saying, but what is not even being covered at all. And so we've all seen, for example, the claims about a famine and people starving in Gaza. And really, this came down to 3 reports that were issued by basically a network of organizations. And so you had one in March 2024, and you can see in the language, they said famine is now projected and imminent. CNN covers it. This is the headline: catastrophic levels of hunger, really kind of hyping up the language here. You had a second report come out in May, a couple months later, which essentially claimed that famine is probably already happening. And then once again, you see CNN broadcast a headline. Notice the date here, June 5th. Mm-hmm. when CNN covered the story about the second report, which claimed that famine was probably already happening. The day before, there was a third report.
Mm.
And this third report essentially rebutted the first two reports by pointing out that they had used incomplete data. Essentially, they took a huge chunk of food that was entering the Gaza Strip, and they took it out of the analysis and then claimed that there wasn't enough food in Gaza.
Whoops.
So in other words, there never was a famine, right? How did CNN cover it? Well, they didn't. Well, they did. They covered the topic a day later by saying that, no, we're only going to focus on the report that still fit that first narrative about famine. You know, that's what's going to get clicks. And let me actually see if I can find another good example that I want to show. Oh, I had a good video. Okay, here's the example I wanted to show. This is another CNN article. You can see the headline, "We are dying slowly. Palestinians are eating grass and drinking polluted water as famine looms across Gaza." This is an extraordinary headline. Palestinians are so hungry that they're eating grass. And they state this in their own words and without any qualification. You go through the entire article and you find one piece of evidence, which I have down here. And it's a quote from a guy named Hamuda. "Unfortunately, many relatives and friends are still in the northern Gaza Strip, suffering a lot. They eat grass and drink polluted water." In other words, this is someone saying some other people are eating grass and drinking polluted water in an area of Gaza that, if you read other parts of the article, he didn't have access to. He couldn't get there. So in other words,
wasn't it already also evacuated and no one was supposed to be there?
correct. Yeah, this was after, I mean, a number of Palestinians stayed. I forget the exact number, maybe about 100 to 200,000 people, if I recall correctly. And this was actually part of the issue with the coverage of the famine story, in that they misquoted the numbers of people there. So they were essentially saying that there were still a lot more people in northern Gaza than there actually were.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when they calculated the amount of food that was entering northern Gaza against this inaccurate number of people that are in northern Gaza, it made the situation look much worse than the actual data would have shown. So this is a good example of kind of another big problem in the media, in that there's this real inconsistent standard of evidence that's really used. And so in this case, they use essentially hearsay from one person in Gaza to make this extraordinary claim. And if I go back to here's another example from CNN. And this has to do with a whole question about whether, well, not question, it has to do with the Al-Shifa hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And the Hamas infrastructure that has been found underneath Al-Shifa hospital. And you can see here in the first two paragraphs, they're really trying to depict this as a false he said, she said story. Well, Israel claims Hamas fighters have been using Al-Shifa hospital. Hamas denies it. Who's to know? Except it's not a he said, she said situation. It's not just that Israel is saying so. Israel has produced video evidence, drone footage. They've taken CCTV footage from the hospital itself. It has been confirmed by multiple intelligence agencies, journalists, doctors, people who have been in a hospital and aren't in Gaza and thus aren't under, threat of Hamas. They've all come out and said, yes, Hamas absolutely is using this hospital, but they sort of ignore all this evidence, cast it aside, and just say, well, it's Israel's claim. And then they also, in this third paragraph, they apply this unique evidentiary standard. Well, yes, the IDF showed it to us. They literally brought us in to show us the tunnel shaft at Al-Shifa hospital, but it doesn't establish without a doubt that Hamas was using it. And so it's just incredible. They're suddenly applying this level of criminal evidentiary standards to anything said by Israel, and yet one guy in Gaza said that people were eating grass, and we're going to take his word for it.
Exactly. There is this unprecedented issue of taking the words of literal genocidal terrorists over those of the government of a democratically elected Western society. Oh, that happens to be Jewish. I forgot to mention that part. But I mean, like before I go on, I want to just take a moment to mention that Kogat, which is the Israeli commission that is in charge of actually distributing food, also happened to put out daily briefings that proved that not only were there when I say hundreds, we're talking like 800 trucks that the food had not been distributed, but that the people of Gaza throughout the war have not only been receiving more food than they were receiving before the war broke out, but we're talking an average of 3,200 calories a day. Now, I could tell you as a fitness expert, no normal person should be eating 3,200 calories a day. That would be considered to be an excessive amount of calories. And so all of this context, all of these facts, what you're showing is sort of like an interpretation of events, but it literally is ignoring blatantly the facts that are readily available to anyone who wants to see them.
Right. Yeah. And there were all sorts of games that were being played with the narrative of famine in Gaza that really in some of those cases really kind of showed a deliberate or a willingness to deceive the audience. There really was no other explanation. I mean, you had journalists. I recall there was another example from CNN where they were essentially applying two entirely incomparable figures to the situation in Gaza. They were essentially saying that they took the figures like in the immediate month after October 7th, when Israel didn't have control of the border for a long period of time. They were still getting order and trying to figure out how to go about things. And then CNN used the figures for that month, and I think maybe the month after, and compared that to the figures before the war started, and claimed that those figures from whether it was like October, November 2023 were reflective of the situation in mid 2024, when there was data for the months after that showed that the amount of food flowing into Gaza had substantially ramped up. And again, from Kogat, like you said, they maintain every day they update a database, number of trucks, number of tons of food and other supplies that are entering Gaza. And another example that comes to mind too, again from CNN, is I recall there was an article they wrote where they claimed that Israel had imposed a blockade on aid going into Gaza, and this was like in 2024. And so I wrote to the editor and said, there's no blockade. You could look. You can go to the border right now and you can see all these trucks entering. And the editor responded, well, they're limiting it, so that could qualify as a blockade.
Yeah. So these are all very, very overt examples of obfuscating reality. But they also use a lot of much more subtle tactics. One thing that is forefront of my mind is their subversive use of adjectives to color opinion. I mean, anybody who is an aware media consumer should know that as soon as you start seeing adjectives, you're not getting an objective opinion anymore. I think most people don't even know what an adjective is, so maybe I'm talking up here. So also, when they use words, some of their favorite words, I'm just going to mention a couple, like occupied, that they casually slip in every time they mention the Jewish state, even when it has nothing to do with territorial disputes. They're talking about a vineyard in the Golan Heights, and they feel like they have to put in this word that isn't even accurate. Or these days, very, very deliberately calling Israeli hostages prisoners. You know, that 9-month-old prisoner, Kfir Bibas, the criminal,
Yeah.
and then calling Hamas murderers hostages instead of prisoners. And words do matter. No matter how depraved the agenda, journalists understand, if anything, this one tenet of reporting: words matter. And for people who don't understand what anti-Israel media bias like literally looks like and how to identify it, can you give us some more of the most commonly used and possibly overlooked keywords and phrases that people should be looking out for to know that they are not reading an unbiased account of events?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I refer to them always as loaded terms.
Yeah.
And you know what one of the questions I always have in my mind is, for example, they always refer to you know, like the Israeli government and far right. Maybe they are, but you never see any label applied to Hamas. You never see them described as far right or fascist or even terrorist, right? Oftentimes the word terrorist is simply replaced with the word militant, and this is inconsistent. Oftentimes, you know, they'll media outlet will defend itself for not using the word terrorist in regard to Hamas, by claiming some standard that we're just going to refer to all these groups as militants. But then you look a little bit further and they have no problem referring to ISIS as a terrorist organization, or Al Qaeda.
Sure.
So those standards are not consistent or consistently enforced or applied. And so there are, I mean, really, occupied is a big one. Oftentimes, really what you're looking for is any kind of terminology that has a meaning beyond its literal meaning, that communicates a set of characteristics to whoever or whomever or whatever is the adjective is describing, that go beyond the literal meaning. You know, again, you know, far right, people tend to think of well, they must be violent and discriminatory and everything. And of course, that kind of fits into these other narratives like, you know, apartheid and ethnic cleansing and whatever. And so it's kind of priming the audience to find those charges more believable by labeling the current government as far right. And ironically, sometimes they use that term also against the government that existed right before the current Netanyahu government with Bennett and Lapid. I mean, Lapid was the most left-wing prime minister Israel's had in decades. And they still charge the Israeli government for being right-wing. So I'm trying to think of other.
Well, I mean, genocide is a big one. And I'm going to say this not because people don't understand it, but if it's not an article that literally is trying to make the case that there's a genocide, which, by the way, there isn't, and any military expert on earth will attest to the same, that there is no genocide, it's a war. But when they just say, blah, 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 the genocide in Gaza, blah, 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 again, it's not just the words, but it's where they choose to very strategically put them in a story so that you almost skim over it. And subconsciously, you're like, oh, I think they said something about genocide, rather than them making a big point about it, right? And so it's like what they call it, like a mind worm or something that just sort of.
Yeah, a brainworm, I think.
A brain. brainworm.
Yeah, it's, genocide is one of those, obviously it's a big topic, and the way they do it, yeah, they often, and it's not just that they kind of randomly throw it in, they skirt responsibility for actually addressing the substance of the charge. And they'll just throw a random quote in from some random, quote unquote, human rights expert, which, by the way, human rights is a loaded term. That doesn't really mean what people think it means anymore. And it'll, people say, or people have accused Israel of committing genocide, or the International Court of Justice, they'll repeat the false claim that the ICJ said it was plausible that Israel is committing genocide, when of course the ICJ said no such thing. And you even had the president of the court, or she was the president of the court at the time they made that ruling, come out and say, no, that's not what we meant. That's not what we said. And it's such the problem with the charge, and I have a bit of a background in international law. As you said, I used to focus on the United Nations, ICC, ICJ, and went to law school. And the thing that they're really not telling you about the charge is just how patently absurd it is, and how they bring in these activists, essentially, and this is another big problem in the media, is that they bring in people they call experts when they're really not experts. They're activists. So for example, I'll go on a little bit of a tangent because I think it's useful to help explain. Amnesty International, frequent organization used to level accusations like genocide or apartheid against Israel. If you recall, about 3 or 4 years ago, Amnesty International accused the Ukrainian armed forces of engaging in human shielding. And it caused an uproar, because people said, no, Ukraine doesn't do that. And the uproar over it was such that Amnesty tried to cover its tracks and say, okay, we'll hire these independent experts to review our process for determining this. Because it was a big black eye for Amnesty. They were really losing a lot of respect. And these independent experts came in and they looked at how Amnesty approached the issue, and they basically found out that, I mean, the gist of it was that they were trying to say that because Ukrainian armed forces were in urban areas, that was proof they were human shielding, but that's not the issue. The issue was why they were in the populated areas. And it turned out that the Ukrainian armed forces were there to evacuate civilians, not to hide behind the civilians, right?
Right.
But one of the things that those independent experts skewered Amnesty for was applying controversial interpretations of international law that do not benefit from widespread support. They're basically fringe interpretations of international legal concepts. And this, of course, is a huge issue with apartheid, but kind of going back to genocide, this is what they're doing when it comes to the genocide charge. The quote unquote experts from these activist organizations that they're bringing on, they are applying very controversial interpretations of genocide to essentially get rid of the requirement that there has to be an intent to destroy the Palestinians as such, and to reword it such that they're essentially trying to say that the mere fact that a large number of Palestinians have been killed in war is proof that there is genocide, and to consistently erode the requirement of intent. Sometimes they pay lip service and they say, oh, well, Israeli leaders referred to Palestinians as human animals. Of course, they never said that. You had a couple of generals refer to Hamas specifically as human animals. But that's, their only evidence they can really apply towards intent. But the problem is when you throw in that one quote from that one Amnesty official, whether it's Omar Shakir or I don't know, Ken Roth is no longer at Human Rights Watch, but he's effectively Human Rights Watch, to say, well, leading human rights experts have accused Israel of committing genocide. that little brainworm they just threw in, and they ignore all this bigger context that shows that this charge really has no merit. Simply because someone accuses someone of something horrible doesn't mean it's worth repeating.
Right. Well, I mean, there have been I can't remember if it was actually South Africa or Ireland that made a formal request that they literally redefine genocide so that it will.
That was Ireland, yeah. And in their application to join the case, they said we think the current standard is too hard to reach, so we want to reduce the level of difficulty for us.
Sure. And therefore, all war is genocide, by the way.
Which, as a lawyer, I look at that and I think, imagine going to a judge and saying, Judge,
I don't like
the
this.
law is too difficult. Can we lower the bar a little here?
Right. Yeah, I really want this conviction. Okay, so I'd like to just backstep a little bit in just getting back into the actual work that you do. So I guess my next question is like, why is it important? Why is it important? Like, who cares? Why do we need to fight anti-Israel media bias? Like, and also, can you talk about the effect that these stories have, like, on society as a whole?
Right. And that's a really good question, and it's one that we get asked a lot of time. And for example, you talked about social media, and oftentimes I hear, well, why are we bothering with mainstream media? Kids don't go to mainstream media; they go to TikTok or Instagram. That's where they get their news. That's where these narratives are being set. And number one, that's actually not true. Well, it is true to an extent for young people. They do, by a large or a much more significant rate, get their news from social media. But by and large, for the population as a whole, mainstream media continues to dominate how people get their political news. Not, paper newspapers, nobody does that anymore, but the websites, CNN.com or watching Fox News. And now, why does that matter? Because it matters to the people making decisions. That's where they get their information from. Outlets like Washington Post or The Hill, where you have a lot of people in Capitol Hill going to get an idea of what's really going on in Congress, what they should be focusing on, or CNN or New York Times. That's where decision makers and policymakers go to get their information. And it doesn't, it matters what people think, because the decision makers care what people think, because decision makers need to get their votes. So how these issues are being covered can have very serious consequences. For example, we saw during 2024, there was essentially the administration started putting limits on the weapons that were going to Israel. And that, of course, came from pressure from the media. There was a very, in my opinion, intentional, concerted campaign by a lot of figures in the media, especially at CNN, which is something we've covered, to portray the use or Israel's use of weapons given by America as somehow being involved in alleged war crimes. And of course, it was all dishonest. And actually, that was one of the examples I had in that slideshow. It was they really like to harp on the 2,000-pound bombs, right? And say, oh, they're indiscriminate. They can affect people, 1,000 feet away. But then in a little, kind of footnote, they admit, oh, but all the craters we examined are all consistent with it being detonated underground. And the 1,000-foot figure comes from bombs that are exploded above ground. So they're applying the figure for bombs being used in a way that they weren't actually being used to try to demonize Israel, and then connect that to, well, America's supplying these bombs and that's bad, and America should stop doing that. And that had an effect. We did begin to see those limits on heavy munitions going to Israel. And the same is true in other countries too. You saw efforts by what you might call lawfare efforts by organizations to try to sue governments and to stop providing weapons to Israel, using this kind of false reporting about how these weapons are being used. So correcting the record matters. Congressmen, the president, of course, they have advisors and experts around them, but they get their information from somewhere too. And so we have to make sure that those sources of information are providing them with a full set of facts that matter for them to be able to come to their own conclusion. And the thing is, even with social media, even with the younger generation, where do you think those media influencers on TikTok, where do they get their information from? Jake Paul or I don't know, I was going to say Mr. Beast. I don't think he talks about politics, but any other kind of big social media influencer that young people are going to get their information from, they're not doing their own investigative journalism. They're just reading the latest headline in CNN.com or maybe a less mainstream outlet, but those less mainstream outlets, they're also getting their information from more mainstream journalism.
How much do you think the biased media has caused, for example, the encampments or what we see in London with hundreds of thousands of people marching every weekend? I'm on the fence. I believe that was all a part of the whole strategy of Hamas, the broader strategy, concurrent with the war, not subsequent to, and that was going to happen regardless. But how much does the media affect whether, some 18-year-old at Harvard decides that he wants to live in a dorm or a tent on the quad?
I think I'm in complete agreement that it would have happened regardless of the media, and I think it's well established that these organizations behind these movements, they're not grassroots, they're not young outraged college kids deciding of their own that they need to go out and protest and have these encampments. It's well documented. You've had these organizations that came prepared. They professional essentially professional protest organizations that have done this before for other causes, and they immediately go and they start training the kids, and this is what you do, and make sure nobody talks to the media, because then they'll find out that the kids don't actually know what they're protesting. And but even though I think it would have happened regardless, it's a matter of degree. Mm-hmm. And I think the poor coverage contributed to the level that we saw on campuses, especially in the United States, because of course they were getting these one-sided stories and explanations. I mean, one need only look at what happened after the coverage of the explosion at the Ali Hospital,
right?
On what was it, October 17th, just 10 days after the war started. That caused riots throughout the world that were blaming Israel for killing 500 people at a hospital. Of course, now, we knew pretty quickly that was false, that it was an Islamic Jihad rocket.
Yes.
That the figure was, according to Western intelligence agencies, the figures for casualties was probably less than 100. I think some European intelligence agencies were saying it was probably more like several dozen. But that poor coverage, those kind of horrifying images that you see Hamas exploit, again with that hospital, if you recall, they literally dragged injured people and corpses in this kind of well choreographed press conference in front of the hospital, and they brought out the chief doctor, and it was a very morbid scene that they were putting on for the cameras. And that's what Hamas is very good at. And they're very open about the fact that this is part of the strategy. They know they can't defeat Israel militarily, but they can delegitimize it and reduce Israel's ability to continue as a state in the international community through other means. It's part and parcel of their overall strategy. And unfortunately, it works with the media kind of being very reckless and unprofessional in how they go about covering these stories.
Yeah. And I think that I see it a little differently than you. And in that, again, I always see things coming from the bottom up. You're saying that the world leaders, are looking to the media for their information. But the way that I see it, I think the tail is wagging the dog these days, and there's this vast groundswell of anti-Israel sentiment. And if you're Joe Biden, who, if you look at his record and everything that he's done over the course of his career, I would argue up until 2024 and I would, including 2023, I would argue that he does have a record of being a Zionist. And he wasn't even afraid to tell the world that, even as he was acting in a very un-Zionistic way, to say the least. And so I think that the media is, with its false narratives, affecting the society, and then society is forcing the hands of world leaders. Yes, they're getting that media, but world leaders also have access to things like briefings or the actual Israeli government if they wanted to find out the truth. And I think that ultimately they're not that concerned about the truth. They're not that concerned about what the Washington Post is saying. Ultimately, what they're concerned about is are they gonna get voted in or voted out next year?
Right. I would suggest it works both ways. I think the politicians, they get their news and they make decisions of their own, but what the public is saying, of course, affects that.
Yeah.
And some of them, they go and they read, the New York Times, not just to get their information, but to see what their constituents are going to be reading.
Right, right.
So I think you're absolutely right. But I do think it works both ways, and it matters. Whatever's coming out of these outlets, it's affecting both the policymakers and the voters who put them in. And there's that dynamic between them where they can reinforce each other, or some doesn't always reinforce each other, but it's complicated, it's complex, and how these things work. But I think we can see it in effect in multiple ways.
Yeah. So this systemic, like, anti-Israel bias is, like, it's been basically ubiquitous, really, across all the most conservative media for at least the last couple of decades. In just the last few weeks alone, I want to go over some of the things that have been uncovered. Camera, issued a detailed report on how the BBC whitewashed Hamas's treatment of the female Israeli hostages, the content of which the BBC has since erased. And though you like to go off on CNN, I'm going to go on a bit of a BBC rant here. David Collier, as we mentioned before we started this morning, he blew the lid off of the BBC's collaboration with Hamas elements on their recent and also since retracted Gaza propaganda documentary, Gaza: How to Survive a War Zone. We also had John Spencer's article, The Battle for Legitimacy in Urban Warfare, which exposed how the New York Times intentionally obscured both integral facts and context in order to mislead its readership into believing that Israel is guilty of war crimes that it did not commit. And, not to rank on the BBC, but it's hard not to, the Asserson report that was based on AI modeling, scientific modeling, that revealed that the BBC shows exhibited pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel sentiment in over 90% of its broadcasts. I can't help but, perhaps not coincidentally, to draw the parallels to this endless game of whack-a-mole that Israel is also forced to play with the terrorists that surround them. So when this pattern of prejudice is so deeply ingrained, I'm curious, is there any amount of scrutiny that would actually compel them to shift strategy? Like, what is camera's ultimate goal when you're up against such lost causes?
I always like to, I can't quote it precisely, but there's this great quote from, the great Rabbi Hillel about, you are not expected to finish, but you are expected to fight when it comes to, your role in life. And I see that very much in our work at Camera, in that, are we ever going to be able to fully fix media bias? We also work in education. Are we ever going to be able to also fix all of those issues? I hope so. But we're up against a lot. We're up against, forces that really go, well beyond even just Jewish community or Israel issues. But we can have a pretty dramatic effect, even with recognition that the battle isn't over and won't be over probably, within our lifetimes. Sometimes it's as simple as just holding the line. You go and you get, for example, CNN to, start declaring that, the Gaza Health Ministry is actually Hamas controlled.
Right.
And you get some success for a while, but then that journalist leaves and a new journalist comes in and you have to start the battle all over again. And that's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but it's what you have to do, because you can't control the hiring processes. You can't control the editing. You can put pressure. And, CNN's a good example where, they tried to ignore us, I think, for a couple of years, and refused to engage with us. And we became such a, pardon my French, but we became such a huge pain in their ass that they finally relented and started communicating with us again and started issuing corrections again. And actually something that came to mind in that front is, as you were mentioning, that documentary from the BBC that was using that son of a Hamas official. One of the things I forced CNN to correct was that they were using as both a journalist on the byline and as somehow an independent witness, which by itself, by the way, that's an ethical problem. But this guy was a paid Palestinian Authority propagandist. He literally worked for the Palestinian Authority's official media agency, WAFA.
Amazing.
And CNN was using him as somehow this credible independent source without any obvious conflict of interest here. Now, in terms of, kind of going back to the effect we have, over time, it does have an effect. And I think we do see it. I mentioned our work in Arabic earlier. Al-Hurra, which is again, it's like the Arabic equivalent of Voice of America. They had some tremendous problems in how they were covering the conflict. But we were able to really meet with them and communicate with them. And we actually found that they were extremely professional and they recognized, yeah, this is a problem. We need to fix it.
Wow.
And they started fixing the problem. Even outlets that are, I'll harp on Arabic because I'm a big fan of our Arabic department. I think they do tremendous work. BBC Arabic has been as big of a problem as the BBC has been. We've also forced the BBC to issue hundreds of corrections in recent years. And that does make a difference, especially because it also sets down a marker, and that this crosses languages, where if you become such, again, pardon my French, but such a pain in the butt for media outlets calling them out over these issues, whether it's communicating with them directly or exposing them publicly. Journalists have egos, and so do editors. Mm-hmm. And if you sufficiently expose them for, practices that are just clearly go against any journalistic ethics and standards, or just are clearly wrong, that embarrasses them and they don't want to make that mistake again.
Mm.
So you do see progress every so often. And yes, sometimes it backslides. You get, as I said, you get a new journalist, but you're constantly pushing, you're constantly improving the coverage a little by little. And in the end, I think without camera, without folks like David Collier, as you mentioned, who, big kudos to him for that expose. I mean, Collier is brilliant, brilliant guy. Everyone should follow him on social media. Um, Without that, I think the situation would be so much worse. It would be, because really, and there's a good example or a good parallel to make. Again, I'm a lawyer. If I screw up in court, I can get disbarred. I'm
Mhm.
accountable to both the court and to the bar association if I engage in legal malpractice.
Mhm.
There's no equivalent for journalists. There's
Well, I'm gonna push back on this lawyer thing for 1 second because one favorite tactic of lawyers is to say things that they know will be overruled because a jury can't unhear it. Maybe the jury can't legally use it in their deliberations, but again, like the thought's been implanted, and I'm going to make the same parallel when it comes to retraction. So we talk about the Al Aussie, is that what the I can't remember the name of the hospital. If you look today, more than half of the world still believes that that was an Israeli bomb, regardless of the retractions. Because first of all, most people don't read retractions. The media, because of their egos, do not want to make a big deal about their retractions. I'm thinking about when I was a kid back in newspaper days where the retractions were like a little tiny like paragraph on like the bottom corner of the inside of the page where it listed all the like just who's on the editorial board or whatever. Like they bury this stuff, and once it's said, it can't be unsaid. So when it comes to worrying about getting disbarred, I think that there's and part of this I think is intentional, and part of it is just this race to be the first person with the story, right? Like that story took what, I don't even remember the thing, 2 seconds to get across around the entire globe or something. Like, I mean, it was
They
something.
were reporting it like 20 minutes. Within
Yeah.
20 minutes, it was international headlines. I remember.
Yeah. So sorry to interrupt, but that's what I just keep thinking of is that they're like, okay, well, will we? I mean, listen, the BBC is spending all this money on documentary that they're like, okay, we'll just pull it, right? Like it's just like it doesn't matter because now it's out there. People have bootleg copies. People have it all over the internet. People like it's out there. They did their job. The story's out there. Everyone knows that and only you and I and the people who are on our team care who this little Hamas boy was.
Right. I will push back against your pushback, though, because what you're saying. Obviously, it's a big problem. I'm not going to dispute that is a big problem. There's only so much a correction can do.
Yeah.
But number one, every person matters. Every person you can get the correct information to matters. And so even if you're only reaching 10% of the people that originally read the article, that's
Hmm.
still a lot better than zero. Um, and that has a downstream effect of people being able to take that correct information and show it to others. But the other thing, if an attorney keeps stating or putting in front of the jury evidence that they're not supposed to, they can be punished if they do it despite warnings from the judge.
Hmm.
They can be sanctioned eventually. We see similar things happen in the media. Legal consequences aside, suing the media, at least in America, is virtually impossible. But when they get burned enough, when it becomes so undeniable that they're doing this egregious problem, such as, let's go to the BBC, for example. They're getting hit from multiple angles, not just from the David Collier story, but also, once again, they're being exposed for replacing the word Jew in Arabic and telling people that they actually just said Israeli. Or they also did it for another word too. It was like, the person in Arabic said jihad against the Jews, and they said, I forget how they translate it. It was like even more benign than struggle. It was just a complete fabrication of what was actually said. But because they've been repeatedly caught over this, this is really what helped tip the balance, along with the other stories too, to the point where you had the leader of the opposition in the United Kingdom.
Right.
I'm blanking on her name, Kemi, I think, that opposition leader, head of the Conservative Party in the UK, coming out and saying these reports are really problematic and we're demanding that some action be taken. And so even if you can't take legal action, there's political consequences, and that gets attention, and that tells people, the broad public, they might not now get the correct information about the Ali hospital problem, but they now know that when it comes to the BBC's coverage of this topic, they need to be wary and less trusting, or not less trusting, but more, they need to scrutinize the information they're getting from these outlets much more closely and much more carefully.
Well, I think that doesn't fully consider the audience. I mean, you think about, okay, 10/7, this is a bunch of genocidal maniacs shooting it on their own GoPro cameras, and people can still watch that and say these are the good guys. The circus of just that the grotesque show of the hostage releases, and of course with the coffins, and people can actually watch this and still go, yeah, but they're not so bad. Look at the Israelis. So I think that that what you're saying is assuming a rational audience. I don't believe we're dealing with a rational audience right now. I believe that we are dealing with people who are gleefully sympathizing with terror. And so it puts us in, like, if we, I'd like to make one more, I guess, legal parallel, is because it's all, the whole thing is a kangaroo court right now, is that, like, it's just like one frivolous lawsuit after another, and you and I and so many different people in so many different modalities are this, like, perpetual defendant. Like, it's like having to prove over and over again that Israel, that has 20% Arabs with equal rights, that are represented in the legislative, in the Supreme Court, in the executive, the head of the bank, of the Bank Lumai, or whatever the number one bank in Israel. Like, you could go on and on and on. And to have to prove over and over again that Israel is not an apartheid state, for example, it's like the Yankees having to prove over and over again that they're not a hockey team. I mean, it sounds ludicrous, but it is that ludicrous.
It's a good analogy.
Thank you. It's just that I think that at some point we need to be able to somehow flip the narrative to one that is, here's the truth. Do you want to counteract it? Instead of, here's this persistent falsehood, because we look dumb after a while, quite honestly. Like, sorry to go on a little bit of a rant here, but to me, I think the biggest challenge right now we face in the social media era is in this pursuit of honest and accurate reporting, is the fact that everyone is skeptical of conspiracy theories, right? And for good reason. Like, I'm very skeptical of conspiracy theories. However, sometimes conspiracies are more than just theories. And the media bias against Israel is like a perfect and well-documented example. I'm sure you know, like, Monty Freeman's Sentinel piece that he wrote for Tablet magazine, like a decade ago during the 2014 war, that reads just like it could have been written today. And by the way, if you read Golda Meir's autobiography, My Life, It also reads like it could have been written today, which is frightening. But in this article, like he clearly outlines exactly how the media agenda against Israel is both meticulously constructed and executed. And people think that freedom of speech and in freedom of the press somehow protect them from propaganda, when in fact what they're getting, it's not the truth, it's the pravda. You know, I don't know if you're as old as I am. I don't think you're as old as I am, but you know what the pravda is, right? Okay. So for anyone who doesn't know, it was the propaganda newspaper of the Communist Party in Russia. Oh, okay. When you grew up in the 80s and the Cold War, you knew about pravda. It was a big thing.
I was born in '89, so I just missed it.
I went to college in '89, so okay. Okay, so how do we make people understand? Like this conspiracy is very, very real and deep-seated, as have conspiracies against the Jews since the beginning of time, because people are dismissing it as just like propaganda or more just contrived victimhood.
Yeah. There's a lot of parallels between anti-Semitism and conspiracy, the willingness to believe in conspiracy theories. I mean, there's literally surveys or studies making that direct link that if you are people more likely to believe in conspiracy theories are also more likely to be anti-Semitic and vice versa. But what I think is very interesting is one of the comments you made toward the beginning about not dealing with rational actors, and the people, they look at these videos and they say, wow, that's a good thing. I think that's true with young people, but not with the rest of the public. I think we are, by and large, the United States at least is full of people who can tell the difference between right and wrong. Now,
okay, I have to ask one sentence word question. Do you think the children are our future?
Well, I think there's some serious problems, and that's what I'll get to, because although I'm going to make a quick point here and say that actually I think in Israel, the young generation is going to be Israel's greatest generation, because they are living through difficult times, and I think they've risen to the moment. But that's an aside. That's me wanting to give credit to the young men and women who have been dealing in very difficult circumstances and yet haven't lost their strength or their faith. So kudos to the young Israelis. But in the United States, we as an organization kind of realize that there is that problem. And so along, I don't remember the exact year, but we've had, for example, Camera on Campus, which deals with campus students, because we began to realize that there's an issue not just in terms of media, but on universities. But I think when we really began to put what's really going on together was a little before I joined Camera, and we formed another department called the Camera Education Institute, which is focused. My role in it, I'm focused on higher ed, kind of faculty administrative issues, but the kind of bread and butter of this institute is focused on K through 12 schools, because we began to realize that, kind of as you said, yes, media still matters, but people are being given such a distorted understanding of Jewish and Israeli history that they are essentially being primed to believe in this anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic narrative that's being delivered by media and at university level. And so we realized that if we want to accomplish our mission of ensuring that there's more accuracy in how people understand and what's going on in Israel, we need to deal with another source of how people are getting their information, which is education, obviously. And so we have the exact same concerns you did. And so we're dealing with it in a number of ways. It's a new institution, so we're really kind of building, but I think we've actually already been doing some pretty amazing things. And one of our big initiatives, for example, is we developed a curriculum for high school history, talking about Jewish history in a way that is, in our view, far more accurate and far more helpful for people understanding Jews today and Israel today, not just, because people, when I was in college, excuse me, K through 12 school, high school, the lesson we get really of Jews is the Holocaust, and that's it. And yes, I'm glad they teach about the Holocaust, but Jews are not just the Holocaust. What about the Mizrahi Jewish history?
Mm-hmm.
What about the Farhud? What about the diaspora, the rich history Jews had in places like Yemen or Algeria or Morocco? What about those who, went to Spain or, and even going much further back than, if they go beyond, the Holocaust, or pretty much just given the Holocaust, the formation of Israel, and that's Jewish history. And so people don't understand that Jewish history goes back thousands of years in the land of Israel. And that's the crucial bit that's really being left out. That's why people today think, all these young people think that Jews are settler colonizers in their indigenous homeland, because they don't understand it's the indigenous homeland of Jews. They don't understand that Jews have been living in Israel for, continuously since, the times of the Bible, or not the Bible, the Torah. Grew up in the Midwest. That's what was always referred to there. I think I was the only Jewish kid in the city. So that's one of the ways we're really trying to go beyond just our media work to really address these bigger, deeper root causes. And our curriculum, we're getting out there in schools, and just as a little plug for that, if you're interested in bringing that to your schools, and it can be high school, public, private, a Jewish school, we want to get it out there.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, Branda Shufutinsky is actually going to be my guest next week to talk about education, K-12 education, and ethnic studies. So,
Tune in for that, because Brandy's brilliant.
Yeah, and Navi, who the rebranded Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, they also have a sample curriculum that they created to counter the current ethnic studies that is so anti-Israel and anti-Jewish. So I was on a call this week. Sorry, this is such a tangent. I need to get back to the topic, but literally that. This is very intentional. There are people who are fighting the people who want to take the anti-Semitic element out of ethnic studies, which is so astounding. You want to think it was mere oversight, but it's not. It's very, very intentional.
Yeah, and you raised, I should have mentioned the conspiracy part of it too. I don't disagree with you that I do think there has been a concerted effort to co-opt these institutions by people that are hostile to Jews, hostile to the state of Israel. And I think they played it very smart over the years. And in a way, the Jewish community, we really let our guard down and let these very important institutions be hijacked against us. And now we're in a deep hole. And so I do always tell people that there's never going to be a magic bullet to the problem that we're trying to deal with, specifically back to camera and the topic at hand of people getting the wrong coverage and the wrong takeaways from what they're hearing in the media. There's no magic bullet. We got here through a slow process. It's going to take hard work and a gradual process to get us out there, and we can't give up just because it's taking time. It will take time if we want to do it right.
This concept of Jewish complacency, though, is actually very sad. I agree with it 100%, but why shouldn't we be complacent that hate is hate and there's no place for hate in this society? Like, why should it be that if we let down our guard, then the tide of anti-Semitism is going to flood back in again? Like, why should that all be? And it also begs the question of our whole conversation today, like the big why. Like, why is anti-Israel bias so pervasive across the media? What is their agenda? Like, why would an anti-Israel stance be adopted in the first place? Like, why would media outlets today take the word of these, as we discussed before, these unabashedly genocidal terrorists over that of Israel, a liberal Western democracy? Like, what's the point?
Yeah. It's another good question. I won't try to answer the bigger philosophical question of why us Jews are always having to fight to prove that we deserve to exist alongside the other nations of the world. I mean, listen, we talk about, in every generation they're going to rise against us, and I guess it's true. I grew up thinking I'd never have to do this, and here we are. I don't want to be doing it, but we have to. Specifically with the media, I think, I can at least offer some insights about how I think and how I'm seeing it happen. And I think the first way to put it is that there has been, we're living in an era where there's a certain ideologies that have really become prominent in education and especially in journalism schools, that portray the world as oppressed versus oppressor. It kind of creates this binary understanding that completely erases nuances. There's oppressors, oppressors, colonized, and colonizers. And that erases not just nuance, it also erases objectivity. Because when you are indoctrinated in this ideology from a young age and education, and especially in universities, you are taught that essentially the message that's often been given is that anything less than fighting against the oppressors is to be a part of the oppressors. Mm-hmm. And this really fits into kind of the conflict too, because there's this, false, easy perception of people that don't really understand history, and they think, oh, Israel is the oppressor, Palestinians are the, poor, brown, oppressed. And so it fits kind of neatly into this ideology that's really being cultivated in our education. But I think there's also some other problems that are, sort of unique to the field of journalism too, which is, maybe not unique to journalism, but are especially problematic in journalism schools. And that's the sense that your profession is activism. And we do see an increasing, it's literally openly talked about in journalism school and professional journalist associations, that they don't view their role so much as reporting the facts, kind of bringing the facts for the public to shining a light on the facts so people can make decisions for themselves. They openly talk about having to educate the public. Well, who says you know the truth? How arrogant do you have to be, a 20-something-year-old who thinks that they can tell the world what the truth is instead of just telling them, what the facts are? And so you get these concepts like solutions journalism, which is, a hot topic, and it sounds all nice, instead of just reporting bad things happening in the world, we're going to report on people trying to fix it. But the way it ends up working, there's this great anecdote I saw a Palestinian journalist make at a United Nations meeting once, and he was essentially saying his version of solutions journalism was, he wanted to report on I think it was like a trial against some Palestinian who was charged with terrorism or something, and he wasn't able to, or he didn't think he was able to get a hold of the Israeli prosecutor. So he just decided that he's going to pretend to be the prosecutor and he'll give the answers for the Israeli side, instead of just like coming up with an obvious solution here, which is just go find another Israeli lawyer, find someone with a similar perspective. But this is, they talk about this as if it's somehow virtuous to kind of, ingrain activism. I do also think that in the media world, there are some less sinister forces that are kind of exacerbating some of those problems too. In the world of journalism and media outlets, there is a tension between the fact that, in some way they are a public service, mm-hmm. but they're also having to deal with the reality of being a corporate entity. They have to make a profit. And with, the way things have gone, you've seen newspapers go out of business, and, CNN is downsizing, and so is MSNBC, because they're hemorrhaging money and viewers, and it's hard for them to stay as relevant as they once were and make money. And one of the ways that they have cut costs to try to remain competitive is often, for example, by cutting the amount of standards editors.
Mhm.
We've seen, some of my favorite outlets that I used to read all the time, I could see the quality decline the moment they started cutting the amount of standards editors, because those were the people that we could really communicate with, because they understood their job was to not to make money, but to maintain the professionalism of the field of journalism, which is an important field. We're not anti-journalism, we're very pro-journalism, but doing it right and in a professional way. And that's what we're not seeing. But unfortunately, kind of the way the market and the country and reality has developed, it's very difficult to keep that level of professionalism and maintain profitability. So it's difficult, and unfortunately, one of the ways you can make money is really by being sensationalist and telling an audience what they want to hear. And so you kind of cultivate. You see some outlets cultivate an audience, like you can just look at like MSNBC and Fox News. They've cultivated their audiences, right? Fox News has cultivated the old school conservatives. MSNBC more of well, I don't know the age, but more liberal. And people who buy into a set of beliefs, and then even within that, you have like MSNBC used to have Mehdi Hasan. He knew who his audience was, and he knew what his audience wanted to hear, not necessarily the truth, but what is going to rile them up, what's going to get them, keeping to come back. So it's. I do think there's a level of, yes, there's a conspiracy. I do think there's also some kind of bigger structural issues that are exacerbating the pernicious effect of those bad actors and how they've manipulated education and the profession as a whole.
Yeah, it's funny because so on your site there's this. I just keep coming back to it because it's so ludicrous that there is a recent headline that you guys wrote that says Reuters corrects. War started with Hamas attack, did not begin in Gaza Strip. I mean, to me, this is surreal. So Reuters' so-called error, completely erases the Hamas terrorist massacre of 10/7 from the record. In like you're talking about, this is pure historical revisionism.
Right.
This isn't an oversight. And by the way, for anybody, I hope everybody knows, but Reuters is not a news agency, it's a news wire, which means they give the news to all the outlets, to all the journalists. And so, this is going out to millions of people. And I hear this every day. People truly believe that Israel started this war, which is, It hurts my head. It's so bizarre. But what's frightening, and of course, everybody's using the word, this is we're living in a truly Orwellian society. We have gays for Gaza marching for the same terrorists who would just as soon throw them off buildings if given a chance. And we have social justice warriors, that many in my yoga community, the purveyors of love and light, who are calling for global intifada and the eradication of all Jews. So how could we possibly, let's say that they read every single retraction, they read every single correction, they read every article the camera puts out, but they're so inextricably brainwashed. And I'm afraid we've reached an inflection point, and I'm hoping it's not a point of no return, because we have the force multiplier of social media. Everybody's always saying oh, you can't defeat Hamas because you can't defeat an ideology. And the common retort is, well, we did it with Nazi Germany. Nazism is all but destroyed. But we didn't have social media, where now instead of 12 news agencies around the world, we have 3 billion. And we have, instead of a 24-hour news cycle, a 24-second news cycle. And so And especially because everything on the internet is not only archived, but so easy to pull back up that in 50 years, there's going to be a million articles when they look back and say the predominance of what's going to come up on whatever's the Google of 50 years is Israel is an apartheid state. Israel is a genocide state, because that's what is flooding, right, the internet. So I think about, like, what could anybody tell me that would turn me against Israel? Like, what could they tell me to convince me that everything that this is not my first rodeo. I've been in this game since before the turn of the century, right? Like this is my thing. And I'm like, I mean, that would be such a high bar. I don't know if it's possible. But these people, like, their bar, they don't even know that they have a bar. They have no idea. They are drunk on the Kool-Aid. They were reared on the Kool-Aid. They are addicted to the Kool-Aid.
Right.
So how do we sell them this glass of clean water when they're like, but delicious Kool-Aid? It's refreshing and sweet.
In my view, you don't.
Ouch.
Well, let me put it this way. You live in California, Los
Yep.
Angeles.
Los Angeles, yep.
There are probably more anti-Semites in the state of California than there are Jews in the world.
Fair enough.
It's just a fact. And I don't like it. It's unfair. The world is unfair. I can't control it. But the reason I bring that up is because if we try to play a numbers game as a Jewish community, we're just going to lose. There's not many of us.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to be smart. And we have to look for ways that we can use our resources, use our time and our energy in the most impactful way. I don't think we can convince people that have already become ideologically brainwashed. I don't think it's a fruitful effort, because you're just not going to convince them. You might convince some here and there, but I think the amount of energy it takes and the success rate you would have is just not there. I think it's more important to focus on the large segment, and it's still a huge segment of the public that is open to hearing our perspective and open to hearing the facts, the ones that haven't made up their mind. And I think that's the vast majority. People might have their slight preferences one way or the other, but they're still willing to listen. And those are the ones I want to focus on. And I think it's sort of like, there's again, we don't go to Al Jazeera because what's the point of that? They're not going to listen to us, but also the people that go to Al Jazeera, they don't want to listen to us anyway. But we will go to the people that are open to listening to, again, Al-Hura. Yeah. Because those people are probably going to be much more in the Arab community. They're going to be more willing to hear a different perspective, one that, their community might refer to as too Western, but they're more open to it. Mm-hmm. So we can have more of an effect there. Yeah. So it's really, I think, we need to be strategic and smart about how we can use our limited resources. Yeah. And, arguing with someone on Twitter, which we all do once in a while, because, sometimes it just feels good. And I'm even guilty of doing it this morning. It's just not productive. We really got to be, we're in such a deep pit that we really have to be smart in how we dig ourselves out of it again.
Okay. I'm concerned about the 74% of young Americans who are now considered to be anti-Israel, but the same percentage of, Republican adults are pro-Israel, right? But it's the same thing we're seeing, honestly, in Congress, right? Like, so when Steny Hoyer's gone, and when like our greatest allies, we're left with what? AOC, who obviously wants to be president someday, and her friends, and people could say, oh, but they're just they're just 3, they're just 12, they're just this or whatever. It's like, okay, well, they're getting bigger, they're getting louder, they're getting more and more attention, they're getting more and more support. And so I understand what you're saying, but we have a real problem with the next generation, and we can't give up on trying to reach them, even though they are vehemently anti-Zionist and anti-Israel. But may I ask you, David? Everybody talks so much these days about free speech. Do you guys come in? Is this a roadblock for you in any way? Is this an argument that people use in your watchdog efforts, and saying, "Oh, well, again, like you're anti, uh, or whatever. You're using bias to you're Islamophobic, you're whatever." Are they using these free speech arguments against you as well?
Oh, absolutely. More so in our education work than the media work. But yeah, absolutely. And it's a deeply misleading argument in most cases. I just, if I may, talk about the education work a little, we'll hear it in terms of, well, no, here's a good example that crosses into both. Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia student that is going to be deported, or may be deported. You see, it's a similar case. Oh, he was just exercising his free speech, and this is the refrain you heard on campus. And now you're seeing it in the media. They're portraying this as, oh, he's just been punished for political speech. Of course, that's not the full truth. Yeah, he said some things, but that's not what he's been punished for. What they're going after him for is the fact that he belongs to an organization called Quad, of which SJP is a member organization and which had openly aligned itself with Hamas within hours of the October 7th attack, saying we are a part of this movement under the unified command that had carried out this attack yesterday. But even more directly, and this is what the administration officials have pointed to, is he distributed Hamas flyers, Hamas propaganda flyers. And that's not just speech. That's providing a service to a designated organization. That's, arguably that's providing material support to a designated terrorist organization, which is completely, you absolutely can prohibit. There's Supreme Court precedent, for example. There's a case called, and I actually just wrote an article about this, literally posted it earlier this afternoon, about the Khalil case, and talk about some of the free speech angles. But Holder versus the Humanitarian Law Project. This was an old case, basically. This organization, I believe, I forget, I can't remember exact details of the facts. I think they went to Afghanistan and they were trying to teach a terrorist organization. I can't remember if it was a Taliban or Al-Qaeda or some other group. They were trying to teach them how to use the United Nations mechanisms. And the Supreme Court said, yes, you can prohibit this. Sure, it just involves speech. You're telling them how can they use these UN mechanisms. You're educating. But the Supreme Court said this is not a free speech issue. This is something that's perfectly allowable to punish, because it's conduct. It's you're not punishing the speech per se. You're punishing your support for an unlawful, criminal, violent organization.
And he's also not a citizen on top of that, but go on.
Yes, and that's another legal issue too. Yes, green card holders have rights. They're not the equivalent of a citizen's rights. And there's precedent about this, but I don't want to get too into the nitty-gritty. But we do see, and again, both education and media, people try to make these false appeals to free speech, and I always find it very ironic because kind of going back to issues of anti-Semitism, we're always seeing this charge that we are weaponizing anti-Semitism, and we're just using it to prevent criticism of Israel.
Right.
And I find that charge to be so ironic, because what we're seeing is description of clear anti-Semitic rhetoric, behavior, support for horrible acts of terrorist organizations, and that's being labeled as, well, you're just advocating for Palestine. When does advocating for Hamas mean advocating for Palestinians? Is it this false equivalence that's being used, and you know, it kind of goes back earlier, we're talking about erosion of words, and how, you know, that's a big issue in the media, but it's also a big issue in this context too, of really kind of broadening concepts to make this misleading equivalence.
But it's also an incriminating equivalence. So here's the thing: at the same time that they're saying that that Hamas is not the Palestinians, right? They are also trying to argue that the Palestinians are Hamas, right? So you can't have it both ways, and it does seem to keep going both ways depending on the narrative that they want to present.
Yeah, no. And I also, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I in my work on higher education, at least, I see claims that criticizing Hamas is somehow Islamophobic.
Right.
And it's the same people trying to accuse us of saying that all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. We don't. Oh, okay. Some people on Twitter do that. Yes. Some people always take things too far. There's always going to be a Jewish organization here or there that wants to shut down an event, and I'm opposed to that. We don't advocate for shutting down events in our campus work. We agree the best response to bad speech is usually more speech. I think there's a little bit of a caveat these days, because what we're dealing with is a situation on campuses where the environment has become so hostile and so toxic that you have a situation in which an entire category of people, Jews, are unable to express themselves without fear of being targeted for harassment or being punished even by the administration, we've seen. And so this idea that there's only a free speech issue on one side it completely misses the point. You really, and surveys and studies bear this out, that Jews do not feel like they can express themselves on campus. It's just a complete inversion of what's really, really going on. And I think it's a concept that's real, or an issue that's really not talked about enough. You know, there's some good people that have done a tremendous work on that. We've tried to talk about it. The Brandeis Center, tremendous advocates on those kind of issues too. Elisa Lewin, Ken Marcus, they've written about these issues a lot. I encourage people to go read, you know, some of their work about this topic. But yeah, it's free speech is important, but it's also overused as a weapon in ways that it doesn't actually apply to try to prevent or to use as a shield against what we're trying to do.
Exactly. Okay, I know you gave me a hard stop at 2 hours. I also told you I was going to give you a 1 hour warning, which, because you gave me a hard stop at 2 hours, that's always dangerous with me. So I just ran with that. Let's wrap this up, because we've got a little less than 8 minutes left, and I do want to finish on a positive note. So 2 things. Please tell us, where people can find you, how they can support you. It's all in the show notes anyway. But you, camera, the whole thing. And also, can you tell me your biggest win?
Oh, well, you can find us at camera.org. You can find our other websites. There will be links at the top of that webpage to take you to Camera UK, Camera Espanol, Camera Arabic. We also have Hebrew, Perspectiva, Camera on Campus, Education Studio, all that. You'll find that there. And of course, you can go there, support our work financially, or you can join our letter writing team, which I talked about earlier. We use our members to help contribute to our work, and I think that's something people appreciate, because it can be very frustrating watching all this bias in the media and feeling helpless, like you can't make a difference. This is one way you can make a difference. So if you feel like you want to make that contribution financially or with your time, we will take both. So in terms of what I think is our biggest win, that is, in terms of media, I think our biggest win recently, I will classify this since, you know, over the last year, I really think is the example I talked about earlier with Al Hurra. I think being able to go to an outlet that had been a problem for so long and to have a professional discussion with them and really be able to make a difference. And we've already seen the progress in how they're covering these issues and using more accurate language and giving better context and more facts. I think it's a tremendous win, and we give a lot of credit, to the outlet, Al-Hura, for making those differences. But it's also been kind of one of the more rewarding things we see because,
Yeah.
we deal with hostile editors, so sometimes it's nice to be able to deal with editors that are they take their profession seriously.
And I think that civil discourse is a lost art in this day and age, and that it could probably take us a lot further than we think.
Yes.
David, thank you for being overly generous with your time, and I apologize for taking advantage of your generosity.
I've had a lot of fun.
It's been a real pleasure to have you, and thank you for all the work that you guys do, and you're doing it for all of us. The repercussions go way beyond the media and really touch all of our lives, even for those who don't realize it. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. I always say, like, okay, the